This is Defy These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub. Welcome everyone to Defy These Times. I'm your host, Ayoub, and today we'll be talking with three guests, Dana Kurd, Leila, Shami, and Romeo Kokriatski, each one of whom have been on this podcast before, to talk about a piece that we all did together for the South-South movement website, which obviously I will link in the description, entitled A View of Anti-Imperialism from the Periphery. And so the essay we wrote was published, a month ago, almost exactly. We're recording this on the 8th of August, 2023. And the essay was part of the South-South dialogues beyond the colonial vortex of the West is in quotation, subverting non-Western imperialisms before and after 24th of February 2022. The date obviously referring to what's called the full-scale invasion or the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia, pretty much ongoing, obviously. That event, for lack of a better term, would at least like Dana, Leila, and I kind of launched or kickstarted, if you want, a bunch of different reflections that brought us back to what we were thinking about related to Syria, obviously to Palestine, the sort of the role, the default attitude almost that we have been seeing as, I'd never know if it's a majority, but it's definitely what we would call hegemonic on the left of at the very like the best case scenarios often tend to be like hesitant on the matter, and the worst case scenarios being, basically overtly whitewashing or supporting or whatnot regimes like Putin's regime in the name of some pretty vague and ill-defined and contradictory anti-imperialism. And that's something that we saw with Syria before and pretty much still ongoing. Folks tend to forget these days that Syria is still a thing. The regime is still bombing. Russia, for that matter, is still bombing, despite supposedly having its hands full in Ukraine. And it seems that we have reached a point, or at least I think so, where we need to really find different terminologies, maybe. And of course, that essay is an attempt to do so. I've personally been quite keen on using the term the periphery as a not necessarily as a replacement for the global South, because I know that there's like an entire history for this, but more of like as a supplementary concept, something that actually makes it a bit richer, because global South often does not include what is usually called post-Soviet countries. And I've been recently actually made aware of how even the term post-Soviet is kind of a bizarre term, because we don't call Germany a post-Nazi state, but it is. But we don't use those terms. And so there's something about the post-Soviet space, quote unquote, that I think also needs to be questioned. But anyway, so this was sort of what we had in mind. We were contacted, and in the end we published on this southsouthmovement.org's website. And I guess I would like to ask the three of you, I don't quite know which order we're going to do. Let's do it by alphabetical order. So Dana, Leila, Romeo. First, introduce yourselves for those who have not listened to any of the previous episodes, which they should, and if they haven't, they should feel bad. But if they haven't, if they are like bad people, can you please introduce yourselves?
All right. My name is Dana Kurd. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Richmond. I write about Palestine, authoritarianism in the Arab world, international intervention, pronouns she, her. Yeah, everybody should feel bad for not listening to all of my interviews. No, I'm just joking.
I'm Leila Shami. I'm an activist involved mainly in human rights, social justice issues. I occasionally write, and I'm the co-author of a book on Syria called Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War.
I'm Romeo Kokriatski. I'm a journalist in Ukraine, and I'm the managing editor of The New Voice of Ukraine, which is a Ukrainian English language news site. And I'm also the host of the podcast Ukraine Without Hype, which is Ukraine news with hopefully less bias and hype than you would otherwise find.
And it's an awesome podcast that I also went on, which you should check out and feel bad if you have not. I like making listeners feel bad at the beginning. I feel like that's a good marketing strategy. The four of us have trajectories, I would say, especially in the past couple of years. Leila and I go a bit further back than as well. Romeo roughly around the time Putin decided to do his thing. we went through different conversations. Of course, we're also in like a number of different groups, and we've been seeing some parallels, some differences are interesting as well, but like some parallels between our contexts, or at the very least between how our contexts, the places we come from, places we cover, places we think about a lot or have some connection to, are discussed, are talked about, are represented, right, in the circles that we either maybe used to hang out in or have some kind of connection with. Like definitely something, it's not like in unfamiliar space, let's say, political space. It's broadly defined or talked about as like the left. And I think more specifically, we would call it like the tanky left, maybe, or the authoritarian left. But crucially, for me, the authoritarian left, and this is an insight that I got from a Bosnian acquaintance and friend that Leila knows, Adnan, who had mentioned like the reason why it works, like this viewpoint, let's say, which we call like essentialist anti-imperialism or pseudo anti-imperialism or alt imperialism, and I had so many different words that we can call it, which is again like this idea that basically America is the only imperialist game in town, and therefore anything pretty much that can supposedly weaken America or be against America or whatever, even when that's not even the case, but anything that can vaguely be argued to be so should either be supported or at least whitewashed or downplayed or whatever. But the insight I got from Adnan, given that his experiences as a survivor of the Bosnian genocide, is that the reason why this sort of works is that there is an already present, how do I say this, like an idea space in which it's almost like the default in some sense within the left. And by default, I mean that in the same way as, and we're gonna get into it as well, like it's not very complicated or difficult to be pro-Palestine on the left. It's almost like it's like how you get your card when you enter the club. It's a very easy thing to do. It's almost like at the time, I suppose, like being for Irish independence, and like there is a history to being pro-Palestine and the left. And of course, Dana, your contribution in this piece is partly about that history, which is a rich one and something that has a lot of pros in it, obviously. And then the flip side is that almost through that same, or almost like it feels like the flip side of that, how to say this, the flip side of that coin in some sense is that other contexts that are not Palestine and other oppressors that are not Israel are often just seen in comparison to those oppressors, i.e., in comparison to usually America and Israel kind of being this extension of America in such a discourse. And this is sort of what we've experienced when it comes to Syria and what still being experienced when it comes to Ukraine, obviously. Russia being the obvious one here, but honestly, China is another example that we've been seeing a lot. And of course, Iran in the Arab world's context, or at least in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, and so on and so forth. So I just want to get some initial reflections on your part, again, alphabetical, or whoever wants to raise their hands or just goes, and whoever yells the most, the fastest gets to be the first to go. Just reflections on your pieces, on your sections, and also like on kind of the entire thing, really, and maybe the project that this South movement is doing, which is a very interesting one, obviously.
So to share a couple of completely, I think, disconnected anecdotes, but maybe I'll be able to string this into a coherent thought. Since the full-scale invasion, one of the biggest kind of changes that I've seen the Ukrainian left go through, and yes, Ukraine has a left. For people that are not aware, this is not a purely Western invention, is the discovery of many Ukrainian leftists that, well, the rest of the world, or specifically the rest of the left, like, hates us. It was, for me, since I grew up in the US and I had experience and exposure with the American left prior to moving back to Ukraine, it was less surprising, though the vitriol and the vehemence and the way the Ukraine became a identifier card for people. Like, Joey, you were saying, you enter the club, you get a I support Palestine card. And the flip side of that, it seemed out of nowhere was Ukrainians are all Nazis. It was a really weird thing for so many of the Ukrainian left to discover, because we always had this idea of internationalism, where the left obviously is should not be bound by national borders or ethnic divisions or what have you. This is explicitly a universalist worldview, where we think everyone should have rights regardless of who or what they are. But that doesn't apply to some. And this is something that Syrian friends and comrades brought up, is like the meme of the guy being hung and asking the person next to him, "Oh, first time?" Because while this kind of depersonalization, dehumanization was new to Ukrainian leftists, obviously there are people who had gone through this process years ago, especially Syrians, before Bosnians, where we are, for whatever reason, just declared by wide swaths of the American Western left to like not be worth it, or we fundamentally cannot be leftists. And that was such a weird thing to go through. Like I said, for me, it wasn't weird that people had this position. It was weird when people refused to learn anything or listen to left voices from Ukraine, refused to educate themselves at all on the topic, and it quickly just devolved into memes of Ukrainian Bandera Nazis, just purely regurgitated Russian propaganda, which intellectually I understood, but at the same time, you know, you're presumably talking to people who share your goals, right? You share a goal of an anti-capitalist world, a world where people are free to do the things they want to do without oppressions upon oppressions being piled up on them, a world where we believe people have inalienable rights. And you'd think that that would be enough of a bridge to convince people that, hey, listen, I am Ukrainian. What all of this stuff that you've learned is incorrect or is flawed or is just an outright lie. And then please listen to us. And the refusal to do so, still to this day, is pretty confusing to me. I've made my peace that the the ideal of internationalism in large parts of the Western left is basically non-existent and is probably impossible to revive. But it's still a struggle to really comprehend how people that you would otherwise agree with have such utterly abhorrent and imperialist ideas about you. I mean, I'm like, for listeners who don't know and who cannot see me in person, I'm not a pure Slav. My dad is from Bangladesh, and I don't look Slavic. I look more South Asian than I do Slavic. And it's really weird when people accuse me of being a Bandera lover or a Nazi, or that I want to like destroy socialism or whatever. By the way, the Soviet Union destroyed socialism. Don't put that on me. Put that on Lenin. But it's so tough to wrap your mind around the inability or the non-desire of these people to learn literally anything outside of their preconceived notions. And that's really what drove my thought process when I was making my contribution to the article. Is I want to make it, I want to lay out how absurd it is to claim that you have these anti-imperial, anti-racist ideas, anti-fascist ideas, and yet you buy into this essentializing reactionary worldview when it comes to some people.
I relate to a lot of what Romeo is saying, because I think very much we come to an awareness of some of these problems with the authoritarian left through the lens of our own struggles. And I think for Syrians and for myself, and this is what I spoke about in the piece, that a big wake-up call was April 2018, where we saw large protests across the Western world that were bringing together people from the left, but also people from the far right, to oppose the war on Syria. But the war that they were opposing was not the genocidal war that Assad had been waging on the Syrian people for so many years, but was targeted airstrikes by the US against the military capabilities of a regime which had just carried out a chemical weapons attack and massacre in the Damascus suburbs. So what Romeo says about a lot of people that were trying to call this out in Ukraine were tarred as Nazis, we also went through in Syria, whereas many people that were trying to raise awareness of the problems of this kind of discourse were targeted as being jihadists, as being Islamists, as being terrorists. And people were genuinely more concerned that we were levelling criticisms against the left and that might damage the left than we were trying to raise awareness of very problematic narratives which were actually contributing to continued attacks, continued genocide against civilian populations in our context. So we've all come to these kind of realizations through the lens of our own struggles, but I think what's very nice is that we all met each other through our own experience that brought us towards something united, and that we're continuing to build those links and bridges of solidarity across struggles. We've seen the same discourse play out in Hong Kong, numerous other struggles, and I think we're now opening this space for debate, and hopefully, we're getting much bigger, those of us who are trying to bring in an internationalist perspective to political struggles, and also trying to bring in an anti-authoritarian perspective. I think we're growing all the time.
Yeah, no, I was just reflecting while you guys were talking about your contributions on also what Joey said at the beginning about how, being pro-Palestine is kind of easy in these spaces. What I kind of wanted to bring to light or to discuss at length in the piece, or in my part of the piece, was that fact. The fact that, obviously, not to downplay anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Palestinian bias in the larger liberal space that still exists, but in leftist spaces, the DSA or certain organizations like that, being pro-Palestine is more accepted. And something that I noticed and how I kind of fell into these discussions is because I was, for a time, in the Arab world, in the context of, not to claim that it's a very representative institution, but in the context of an institution that's pan-Arab, it has people from all over, different kinds of people from the Arab world, and something like a tanky mentality was not accepted. It was seen as fringe. So even if there were maybe a few individuals associated with that institution that may have harbored certain ideas about Syria or things like that, it was they genuinely could not express it, because I was in an institution where it's not just Palestine focused. It's discussing the issues around the region, and many of the people that I worked with had directly been impacted by Iran, had directly been impacted by Russia, so it seemed like a no-brainer. And then I start getting online and then I moved back to the US, and I'm flabbergasted at the differentiation in the discourse. What was considered completely fringe, like the Max Blumenthals of the world, are seen as more valid in Western leftist spaces. And I was just really outraged by that, because I don't see Palestine as being, as a Palestinian, I don't see Palestine as being separate from any of these issues that are occurring in the region or in the world. And I think that all of these struggles are connected in various ways. That comes out in the themes of my research, comes out in any activism I have engaged in. And so it may have been easy for me to just talk about Palestine. I think that a lot of Palestinian activists do that, but I just couldn't understand how we could build power in that kind of siloing and that kind of fragmentation, in accepting allies that harbor anti-Ukrainian views or anti-Syrian views. I just didn't I thought it was morally obviously repugnant, but also strategically very poor. And just to be clear, like the fact that amongst young people, latest polling here in the United States, 18 to 24, I think, 30% of them would vote for somebody like RFK Jr. Like that tells you what this kind of like anti-imperialist or whatever, however we wanted to describe this kind of viewpoint, how much damage it's done to leftist spaces. That we risk a Trump again, or even worse, given the environment. The last thing I wanted to say, just really briefly, is to comment on Romeo's discussion of how like we're seen as somehow outside the fold, like Ukrainian Syrians. Yassin al-Hajj, who's a Syrian activist and theorist, like talks about the Syrianization of the world. Like you are in this like periphery, and you're outside the fold of like humanity, and what the rules that exist for human rights and human dignity don't apply to you. And the danger is that's spreading. It's not just Syria. And it won't be just Ukraine, and it won't be just Palestine, but leftists just don't make those connections.
Yeah, one thing, okay, so obviously a number of things, but there's this amazing term that at least I learned after our thing was published, which is sumud washing. So there's a piece published on Kohl Journal, KOHL, I will put it in the description, by Nairoz Abu Hatoum and Razan Ghazawi. It's this, it's called a Journal for Body and Gender Race, which is a pretty good journal. And so they coined this term sumud washing as a pretty specifically in terms of like positionality, Syrian, Palestinian, queer, feminist, decolonial lens. Sumud is the Arabic for like steadfastness. And it used to be, I mean, to some extent, I guess still is, Dana, you can correct me, but like associated with the Palestinian cause, but also different types of resistance against Arab regimes at the time, especially those that were seen as allied with Israel. And the thing is that the Arabic language has those terms, like they already exist. And for example, in Lebanon, it doesn't make sense to say tanki, like that doesn't mean anything. But we can easily identify the quote unquote left, like the parts of the Communist Party and so on that are sort of like pro Hezbollah, or like they whitewash Hezbollah, and we just call them mumena. Like we have that term. And the muqawama obviously is the resistance, and now it's basically synonymous with Hezbollah. But it's not used in the sense of, like, even I may use the term muqawama without actually meaning, oh, they are the resistance. It's just, this is the title that they are. This is what you, in the same way, like, Al-Qaeda is, I'm not calling them I don't know how to translate these things. Sorry, listeners.
No, they've appropriated resistance.
Exactly.
Like that's how they
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are these nuances that I guess can be difficult when translating them into English or in different contexts or whatnot. But that's why I'm grateful for that term, sumud washing. I will definitely be using it. I'll be referencing it. We'll try and maybe do something on it very specifically at some, because they're very specific to the Arab world. And it does pertain, or it is connected, if we want to, at the very least, the Syria and Palestine and Lebanon sections that we were covering in that essay. I would be very interested to look at how the parallels with the Ukrainian context, the differences, maybe that's something we can pin for now. But essentially, it means like the Syrian regime, pretty notoriously for those who kind of are from Syria, or even Palestinians who grew up in Syria and so on, uses this resistance against Israel narrative to effectively justify everything. And we know this from the early days. And people on the Lebanese left, anti-authoritarian Lebanese left to be more specific, know this history quite well, because we know, and I'm glad the piece on Kohl Journal mentioned that the Syrian regime intervened in Lebanon in order to crush the Palestinian resistance at the time. And this is one of those things that like many people already know, but it's almost like it's been siloed into, like, I don't know, a part of our brain, compartmentalized, like we don't want to think about it too much. But like this facilitated the more known, I suppose, invasion of Lebanon by Israel in 1982, because by then the big coalition that was pretty much winning by the 76, 77 era, what is now called Lebanese Civil War, they had like 85 or 90% of the territory between the Palestinian, the Lebanese nationalists, the Lebanese communists, the Pan-Arabists, all of that stuff. not Lebanese nationalists, sorry, pan-Arab nationalists and so on, they were the biggest alliance by far, and the minority essentially was the what are now, like, we call them they call themselves the Lebanese nationalists, but effectively they were like right-wing Christian militias associated with the Maronite bourgeoisie at the time, and so they were losing. That small elite, whatever group of people were losing, and it was Hafiz al-Assad himself who basically, either directly or indirectly, this is not something that we know for sure, obviously, because these things are not exactly transparent, but let know the Americans that he will take care of it, essentially. And you would assume that this was also done with Israel's knowledge, or at least approval, or whatever. And we know for a fact anyway that after 82, after Israel invaded, Israel was kicked out in 2000, so that's 18 years. And Syria wasn't kicked out, or the Assad regime wasn't kicked out before 2005. So you had an 18 years overlap between the Israelis occupying southern Lebanon and the Syrians basically occupying the rest of Lebanon. And by Syrians, I mean the Syrian regime here, the Syrian army, basically de facto occupying the rest of Lebanon. I still remember the checkpoints and stuff like that. And they obviously had made a truce to make that possible. And throughout that entire period, and continuing to this day, Israel has been occupying the Golan Heights, the Jolan. And so Razan and, I'm sorry, I forgot the other person's name, Nairuz's piece on Kuhl talks about that very specific positionality, that of the Jawlani, the Syrian from the Golan Heights, and their positionality vis-a-vis both Israel, which has annexed de facto, at least recognized by the US, not de jure, obviously, the Golan Heights, and the Assad regime, which the like Jawlani activists and leftists and so on would always describe, like the Assad regime would always be hostile to them because they're seen as like two Israelis or whatever terms they're, basically seen with contempt, if not with suspicion, and so on. And those are the positionality, those are the experiences that kind of drew me into the Syrian context. In Syria specifically, before even knowing much about the Golan Heights, it was the Yarmouk experience. So the Palestinian refugee camp in Damascus, or outside Damascus, I don't know how these things are called, that was utterly destroyed, like almost virtually eradicated by the Assad regime, in a way that we in Lebanon haven't seen since, like, Israel tried to do the same for the entire city of Beirut, for example, in 1982. And yet there was this complete disconnect in some people's mind, which I discovered later on, not at the time, because I was still in Beirut, and like I just had what was happening in Yarmouk was just it wasn't part of this online discursive battle. It was just like, this shit is happening, and we are seeing photos and images and videos and people literally leaving anyway. So people would literally be telling us, because like it's not that far. Lebanon is tiny, one of the smallest countries in the world. And so it was just this lived experience thing, in the same way that if from Gaza, this was possible, like geographically, we would be hearing the same things of people fleeing and coming to Lebanon, for example, and telling us the same things. But there was an easier communication between parts of this, or at least this Mumena side of the quote unquote left in Lebanon. And I don't know how to define them. Like, I don't know if they technically on the left they are, but I don't know. Like they're pretty right wing on a lot of things as well.
I mean, they're not really left if we think about left morally, but they claim the left, and they're accepted by the left. So
they are the reason why in Lebanon there is almost this exception or now less so since 2019 revolution, but there's this exception when it comes to Hezbollah. That is like when you say like kilon yani kilon, like all of them means all of them. There is a like, but do you really mean all of them? Like that kind of thing. Like it's a bit more difficult to criticize Hezbollah than it is to criticize the right-wing parties like Lebanese forces or what have you. Now less so. Now it's much more open, but at the time it was definitely more difficult. By the way, all of this to say that the Mumena types almost had like a direct line of communication with a lot of people in Gaza. And you physically cannot go to Gaza, obviously, from Lebanon because Israel has the blockade. But it was there, whereas with Yarmouk, like the border between Lebanon and Syria was kind of technically still open. Definitely, not closed because you can't, because that's like most of Lebanon. And, you would have these stories left and right, but they would kind of be falling on deaf ears, to use that metaphor. And that's what kind of led me to, one of the things that led me to question a lot of the sort of the assumptions that I thought that I had vis-a-vis the left, in the sense that like this, we are the moral side, we're the good guys or whatever, we hate oppression, not our thing, we don't like it, and so on. And in the beginning I got into it through my like Palestinian background and activism and all of that stuff, and I just assumed very naively in retrospect that it's the same logic that would just be extended to those other contexts. Like, of course, Israel, what's doing to Palestine, bad. What Assad is doing to Syrians, bad. And that's it. Like that's the end of it. We should be talking about other things now. It wasn't the fact that it was a sticking point in and of itself always bugged me. Before I was more drawn into kind of thinking about it politically and trying to make sense of it. And this is after that, like, reading Syrian accounts, and Yassin Hashsallah was a big one at the time, and Jumhuriya, Leila's writings for that matter, a bunch of other folks' writings. This is when I started understanding, and of course on Twitter and Facebook, a lot of Syrians talking about this thing that now Romeo, honestly, I wish there was a way of just getting these archives very efficiently and very quickly, because I could just change, like instead of Syria, the word Syria, you put the word Ukraine, or in Hong Kong at the time, of course, like it was, the complaints were so similar that I think Leila, I talked to you about this once, like I felt insane. Like I felt I was losing my mind at how similar these things are, and yet how obvious they were in my brain, and yet how not obvious they seemed to be elsewhere, or at least there was this very difficulty. There was this difficulty talking about it. And so this is sort of kind of a bit of the background of like my motivation, if you want, or whatever. And then it sort of just followed from there. So this podcast and other stuff and whatnot, like just, a Ukrainian who's saying this exact same thing, and because of the algorithm or whatever the fuck works on Twitter / whatever the fuck it's called now and stuff like that, they would meet, Syrian, or they would hear about this experience, and then maybe on Taiwan, and you would have those things in the replies, like Taiwanese people saying, yeah, we went through this as well. Oh, sorry, Hong Kongers saying, we went through this as well, or Taiwanese saying, like, we are talked about this way as well, and so on and so forth. And yeah, so some thoughts on your part, and then I'll take it to the next stage of this conversation.
I think one of the problems is that instead of having a copy and paste or consistency again on moral values and standards that Dana related to, what you actually have a copy and paste of is narrative. And that narrative is that the US is always evil, anyone opposing the US is good. And you see, that's the reason you could copy and paste any of these statements written about Ukraine from Syria or many other struggles, because the narrative doesn't change. It's completely irrelevant what the local context is, what the politics is, what the history is, what the economic situation is, what the culture is. The narrative stays the same. It doesn't adjust according to different struggles. What we should be having consistency with our values and our principles, that we're against oppression, that we're against injustice, that we support people in struggle against oppressive regimes, or support people in struggle against imperialist powers, whether those imperialisms are Western imperialisms or they're Russia or they're Iran.
It's funny, Joey, that when you started talking about this, like, Assad bad, and we move on, like that's the end of the discussion. It's pretty obvious, because I had a very clear flashback to the beginning of the regime's war against its own people, basically. And I remember sitting in college and discussing it with a couple of my classmates. And I literally went, well, I mean, he's a dictator bombing his own people. It's pretty clear, like, he's an asshole and should be removed. There wasn't like, there wasn't even the thought that that there was another way to evaluate it, that I have to look at American geopolitical interests and think, is this bad for America? Like, no, that doesn't matter. Like, the moral lesson here is completely clear. And I didn't draw that connection with my experiences in Ukraine until just now, because I had the exact same feeling now that I think about it. Like, it's morally obvious that you shouldn't invade your neighbor in a explicit war of conquest. Like, that's obviously evil. And the fact that that isn't the end of discussion, and we keep having to explain basically what is, I think, kindergarten level morality to people who are basing their whole ideology on we're the good guys. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
I had this theory that I need to elaborate at some point, but that it's not that different from, or at least in essence, it's not that different from what we call realpolitik, like of the Kissinger variety. And I mean, I hope this variety doesn't last as long as Kissinger lasts, because he's already 100 years old. It is that in sense that we have to, I remember, I think it was Owen Jones, one of the British left-wing commentators or whatnot, who described Ukraine as, or at least described like that entire area, or whatever, as part of like Russia's sphere of influence. And that's a Kissinger terminology. The fact that the world can be, or like that's a Fukuyama situation, like that. The fact that you can divide the world in those camps essentially is by definition a campist worldview, and that's not something that has never really been something outside of the Stalinist and all of its echoes around the world variety. It hasn't been that. It wasn't that, and I'm not trying to romanticize the left's history necessarily. Lots of fucked up things happen as well in left-wing spaces and whatnot. But in terms of basic understanding of like literally you go on Wikipedia and you write left-wing politics, that sort of thing should be at least non-negotiable. I'm not saying that there can be no room for discussion of what to do and what not to do and whatnot, but there has to always be this fundamental. In the same way, like, in the US right now, the whole transphobic shit by the right is non-negotiable. Like, this is not something that we can or should be compromising on. And the same thing, supposedly in Europe, it should be a non-controversial thing to say, like, we support migrant rights and refugee rights, although these days it's not as uncontroversial anymore, obviously, as it should be. Let's say there are lots of left-wing parties that are very not pro-migrant. I'm wearing a shirt, migration is not a crime on purpose. Because it's still a thing. It's a problem. Anyway, sorry. I know, Dana, you wanted to say something.
I was just, absorbing what you guys are talking about and how, like, you've lost the motivation to even explain, and I totally get that. But I think we also should differentiate that, like, leftists that maybe are active as even maybe minimally as organizers or in these kinds of organizations are different from like the rest of society, frankly, like normal people. And then even amongst leftists, there's like the people who are like confused and don't know. And then there's the people who are actively taking this position. And the reason I say that is because, like, if you think about like Palestinian public opinion, like it was actually quite pro-Syrian revolution. And then when it comes to the Ukrainian issue, it's very polarized. There's like 40% who blame Russia, 30% who blame Ukraine, and like some people who don't know. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but they're in the piece. So Joey will link to that. But the point is, I think for most normal people who are not part of this kind of milieu of discussion, it's very clearly a moral issue. But because of the Russian disinformation, the narratives by thought leaders, by these organizers that have an outsized voice, even if there's not a lot of them, then it starts to muddle the picture for normal people. And then even, like I said, even amongst people who consider themselves like actively part of the left, there are some people who just don't know and absorb that confusion. And then some who I think are such Western chauvinists that they center themselves without really, critically thinking about that genuinely believe only U.S. intervention is the worst evil. And so anything that might facilitate a discussion on U.S. intervention should be shut down. Even if we pretend that Bashar, like, they know everything about Yarmouk. They know everything, everything you just mentioned. But we're going to pretend like that didn't happen. We're going to absolutely like play this game of narratives and disinformation because we have a higher goal, which is to stop any kind of U.S. intervention. And it's gotten to the point, like you, I really went through some mental health struggles when I started, commenting online because I was being harassed so often about things that I thought were so simple. People were like scoffing at me when I used the word authoritarian. And I'm like, am I like in a parallel reality? Like, does authoritarianism not exist in your world? Like, but that's the level of discourse that we have to deal with, because there are certain people who are doing it on purpose. They are doing it to muddle the discussion. And unfortunately, those people have winnowed their way into major organizations and have like done such damage to especially like younger folks who are absorbing this kind of information. But yeah, I just thought like I should differentiate between normal people and like non-normals. I count myself as a non-normal here, just FYI.
It's so weird to me because I definitely remember. Maybe I am hallucinating. Maybe we did all cross into like a parallel reality, because I have like pretty distinct memories during the U.S. war in Iraq that people on the left would criticize these dictators like Assad for cooperating with the U.S. Like everyone, it was public information that Assad allowed the U.S. to operate black sites in Syria. Like this was not some hidden thing. This was one of the main critiques of many of these regimes, is that they worked with the U.S. and they allowed the U.S. to basically do all of its horrible legal torture bullshit on their territory in exchange for dollars. And then you fast forward not really that long, and it's like that just didn't happen. That's not anything. You bring it up, people accuse you of like parroting CIA talking points. Like what happened?
It's just a decade. That's what's like. It's one of those things that you have those books like I should have sent the like because now I forgot the name of the author. I'll remember it at some point. But like it's almost like describing the interwar period as in between the First World War and Second World War in Europe and the West, and even honestly the rest of the world. That's kind of a special period because of what happened after, rather, and obviously what happened before. And there's something to be said about that decade, because it's literally like 2001, between 9/11 and the Arab Spring. It's just 10 years. That's kind of insane, given everything that has happened basically in my teenage years. And it's something that I've been kind of pondering, and maybe like with a bit more distance at some point I'll be able to, or we can able to kind of reflect on this a bit more and whatnot, because a lot of the things that we're talking about now as being like almost taken for granted, the tanky stuff or whatever, was a bit more in flux at the time, and there was a bit more I don't know, maybe confusion would be I'm not sure what the term would be, but there was definitely more.
Well, there was less like direct international intervention in these discussions to weaponize them. There was less Chinese funding and Russian funding.
Exactly. And that's the thing, because the example I always think of, to go back to the whole Mumena thing, is that in the beginning of the Arab Spring, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gave a speech basically celebrating the brave people, our brave Arab brothers and whatever on the streets and stuff like that, because that was before it really came to Syria. It was already starting in Syria, but there was a period of time, and I remember there's an interview that he did with Julian Assange, which is I think still online, which is a fascinating thing as a document. Basically, like, we're even negotiating between the opposition and the government, or stuff like that, and calling them the opposition, right? Like calling them. There was a sense of like we're not fully on board necessarily, and that's why a lot of Syrians and Palestinians, for that matter, were maybe still on the fence about Hezbollah, wondering whether, are they going to be on our side? Are they not? We're getting mixed messages here, that sort of thing. And of course, many others had no illusions about that. But that's what I sort of remembered. And I know that, for example, the intervention in Libya is this whole controversial thing, whatnot. And I don't want to get into it because I don't care at this point. But Hezbollah supported it, and Lebanon officially asked the UN to. Lebanon was one of the signatories in that resolution at the UN to allow intervention to prevent Muammar Gaddafi's threats against the population, to stop them. And Lebanon had no problem with that, because there is this internal Lebanese thing, especially within Hezbollah and Amal, which I won't get into as much, but that had to do with really hating Muammar Gaddafi. And this is something that gets lost in these discussions, that at the end of the day, we're talking like he's, as a figure, for example, romanticized. I know this is a problem in some Pan-African spaces, for example, that he's romanticized as this Pan-African figure and whatnot. And the guy was like an open racist who was chilling with Berlusconi. Like, facts don't matter in these spaces. They just don't. Not to mention misogynist. Like, these things just don't matter in these spaces. And that's why, for me, I'm finding it fascinating, for lack of a better term, that we are at a time now when it's almost like you can almost predict that, like, if there is some kind of normalization discussion with Israel, like the Arab states, there seems to be in parallel, or maybe just after, a renormalization with the Assad regime. Like, they're almost following one another. And there's something happening. And I'm not saying like in the conspiracy way. I'm just saying that
No, it's just like the Western establishment's agreement that the way to deal with these pesky peripheries is authoritarian conflict management. Yeah. Like, that's
conflict management.
Whether
exactly.
It's Israel, whether it's the Syrian regime being normalized, it's the same really underlying policy, which is these people they can't have democracy. They won't have human rights. Mm-hmm. Maybe they can have subsistence.
I think the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict is a perfect encapsulation of this, because literally in real time, you see the West basically turning a blind eye to the literally just genocide, right, of Armenians in Karabakh and Artsakh. Like, regardless of what you might think are the merits of the Armenian or Azerbaijani side, I think people shouldn't be starved, right? That's a pretty easy thing to see. But there's basically no pushback from anyone, any country, any leaders in the West against these area actions. It's just, okay, we cut off Russian oil, but we still need Russian oil. But Azerbaijan is willing to sell us Russian oil and claim that it's theirs. That means we're just not going to say a word. Whatever they do, we don't care. It's all the Armenians brought it on themselves. And when you bring it up in a left perspective, people are just like, oh, they're just like uneducated mountain peoples. They're just going to kill each other and fight. Like, there's no left-wing analysis, apparently, which is, again, just insane, because how can you really see yourself as the good guys if you're just willing to ignore clearly, like, moral judgments on ongoing events? I've said it boggles my mind, but every time I think about this, I really try not to think about this in my daily life, but every time I think about it, I'm just stunned, really, by the doublethink that's become so commonplace.
Yeah, we've heard so many times, like, Arabs aren't ready for democracy and they need an authoritarian strongman to keep them in power. And it just shows again the absolute disconnect between the discourse and the reality, because what we saw in Syria, of course, was that when the state was pushed out of 2/3 of the country, people implemented themselves a very grassroots participatory democracy. It was democracy that people were fighting for, and that we see that actually the only obstacle to democracy that we have in Syria, and I imagine in many of the countries in the region, are these authoritarian regimes.
Mm-hmm. And so to bring us back to a bit of the kind of the headline, right? The like anti-imperialism from the periphery. Maybe we can, and we're coming up to an hour here, as a way of like slowly wrapping up, because it's one of those conversations that honestly can last 10 hours. And I've been told listeners don't want to sit through my voice for 10 hours, which I don't understand why, to be honest. So what is it about the periphery? You know, South-South movement, right? There is something about that. Like, it's a South-to-South movement. And there's this other term, right, like the global East, to talk about, quote unquote, the post-Soviet space as well, as a different thing, related but different, to this kind of almost in between, to simplify things, the matter between like the global South and the global North. All of these are questionable, problematic, to be criticized, to be critiqued, whatever concepts, but they may, at least in the short term, help us at least think through certain things. Because the term global South has its critiques, obviously, and I've tried to make them as well. Not that I don't use it, or I think it's completely useless or whatever, but there's something about like China that feels the term global south doesn't really apply that much anymore in that same way. That there are these other qualifications that need to be added to talk about different.
There's a south in the north and a north in the south.
Yeah, that's it. And there's there are centers in the north, and there are peripheries in the north. Like the banlieues of Paris are technically part of the global north, but they're not treated as such by the global north, by the Paris government, the French government. There's something about that, and we know this, obviously with the recent uprisings of like ex-colonial subjects being treated similarly to how colonial subjects would have been treated, because they are themselves descendants for the most part of what used to be colonial subjects. And there's something there. There's something about the way Russia talks about Ukrainians, the way Putin himself has talked about Ukrainians, is not that dissimilar from how any kind of like dominant political power, for example, the Chinese Communist Party has talked about Uyghurs, really. Of course, there are differences here and there, and in China, it's like, well, as long as you stop being Muslims and stop being Uyghurs, you're welcome to become Chinese. And it's that kind of with Putin, right? Like it's Novo Russia. It's like, oh well, they're actually Russians in denial or whatever. And there is that dimension to it, which I think that if folks don't take that into account, that this is a very violent and authoritarian way of seeing the world, the rest of the isms are kind of pointless. Romeo, I know you've mentioned this a number of times, that at the end of the day, the whole debate as to like what kind of weapons should Ukrainians take and where should they say no and whatnot, is like, give them the options in the first place. Like that's kind of the thing. Like, where are the warplanes? I don't want, because of the whole cluster bomb thing. I understand clearly they're not good and they're very bad for everything. But still, where are the warplanes? Like, what can be done in that situation, given that what they are asking for is either not given or it's given very late, or and so on and so forth. And while at the same time, of course, we know a lot of Western diplomats still complaining that like Ukrainians are asking too much or whatever. And I don't know if you remember, Romeo, just as a kind of a parenthesis, and I'm going to shut myself up. But in the beginning of this entire thing, I kind of said, and I've been repeating this a number of times, is like what Ukrainians need to immediately understand is that they shouldn't be asking the West, they should be demanding. That they should recognize, like, and honestly, they did that. So like, it's not like, oh, they didn't. But like, just remember at all times that whatever solidarity, support, whatever is coming from the West is always fragile. It's always like at the moment's end can stop overnight, as Trump did with supposed allies, in the Kurdish areas of northern Syria and stuff like that. Like this has always been a thing with the Americans, especially, but honestly with Europe as well. And that all of the discourse and whatnot that misses that aspect, that is very ephemeral, and that this is about stopping Russia as much as possible, as quickly as possible, because we don't know, we the Ukrainians here, like, don't know how long the support can come. And obviously if the support stops or gets worse or whatnot, this can already make things more difficult and so on and so forth. That sheer pragmatism for me, if it's not survival question, if it's not like at the forefront of any debate of like what should we do, then it's sort of saying like the geopolitics, the realpolitik can always trump, pun intended, other questions. And that's why, like, for me, the question of like the right to intervene, the duty to intervene, is a complicated one, but is one that the left should be engaging with. And it's one that for the most part we pretend is either not there, like there are no contexts ever, at any context in which we quote the people in the West, whatever, the states that would be in theory capable of doing so should intervene. Like there are no contexts whatsoever, which makes the World War II kind of an awkward example for those who want to think about it. And that's why they end up not wanting to think about Bosnia, not wanting to think about the Rwandan genocide, not wanting to think about Kosovo for that matter, or Libya, because this brings up these questions that are, and it's easier to just say, oh, well, it's like Iraq, Libya is like Iraq. Because if you say that 2003, like Libya 2011 is like Iraq 2003, because if you say that, you don't have to think anymore. You don't have to think about Libya. You don't have to think about Gaddafi. You don't have to think about the people on the ground. You don't have to think about any of this. You can just think, well, it's like close enough to Iraq on the map, and whatnot, whatever. Like they had it good, clearly, and it's all a conspiracy, color revolution, etc., etc. it's easier. It's an easier way of thinking about the world, and it's maybe comforting for some to just think in those simplistic binaries. But I keep on worrying that if there aren't these basic values that are non-negotiable, that have to do with, like, for lack of a better term, like the sanctity of human life, whatever, like these very basic things, if they are debatable, I feel like we're kind of already lost the debate, because the right is always going to do a better job at that. Like, they're always going to be better nationalists, as Moshe Postone once said. Like, the right are always better nationalists than the left, and we shouldn't be playing that game. We should be changing the rules of the game. And that ends my TED talk. So thank you for listening, everyone. And I'm gonna leave our guests to end on their thoughts and recommendations and call to arm and propaganda and all of the above.
Really quick before we wrap up here, I just want to address one of the things you said there, Joey, which is this idea that aid is very conditional. I just wanted to note that, in fact, some of the biggest criticisms from Europe, even from the UK, which has been shockingly one of the more stalwart partners of Ukraine, has been that Ukraine's asked too much. This is something you heard pretty much constantly from French and German diplomats, especially in the first year of the full-scale invasion, is that Ukraine wants too much. They're not grateful enough. There was just a scandal just a few weeks or a month ago where the UK Defense Secretary, or is he the former Defense Secretary now? I don't remember. Yeah. But Ben Wallace, who was a UK Defense Secretary very recently, gave an interview to some Lithuanian paper where he was also seemingly complaining that the Ukrainians, that we were asking for too much, that we were not grateful enough for the help that we've received. And I think this is one thing that Ukrainians are aware of. We're very aware that aid can dry up pretty much at any moment. And we are very aware that democratic countries can change governments, and those new governments can have completely different priorities with regards to us than the previous government. So there's no stability there. But at the same time, there's not much to do to kind of tie it even to a even earlier point that you made, the global east, which I hadn't heard that term before, but it kind of makes sense. I think one of the big differences between the post-Soviet world, to use that trite phrase, and the global South is that by and large, these countries want to become more European. But what they see Europe as is not quite how Europe itself sees itself. We see Europe as transparent, anti-corrupt, with a level playing field, rule of law. Europe is not conceived as a colonial oppressor that's grown fat off the blood of its slaughtered subjects. It's seen as a troubled region that managed to rebuild itself, while we, after 30 years of independence, haven't been able to match their speed. And for Ukraine, this is especially resonant because we just look at Poland. Poland is not just our neighbor geographically, but a lot of Ukrainians have ties to Poland. There's a lot of cultural connections. They left the Soviet Union in about the same situation that we did, but they are remarkably better off than Ukraine. They've managed to build themselves into what Ukrainians consider a European nation. And I think this is going to be a big sticking point, or rather, this is going to be something that I hope discussions like we're having now that we've had will examine more thoroughly, because I think there is somewhere to think about how the things that Ukraine thinks Europe is not, I think, something that is a European exclusive thing, but like a lot of European nationalists, or whatever you want to call them, European chauvinists, say that this is a uniquely European thing, that we are uniquely Yeah, there you go. I think these values are universal. People want transparent governments. People want rule of law. So these are objectively things that make life better for, Joe Schmuck, like the average person on the street. And these are not magical European values that can only be adopted if we like throw away all of our identity and say we're European now. And I think it's stressing the kind of universality of those ideals, I think, is going to be very important to continue to build solidarity and connections between the global East and global South, as you put it. Oh, and my recommendation, since we're wrapping up here, read. I recently started reading on, I forget whose recommendation, but thank you, whoever that was. I'm no longer talking to white people about race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. A fantastic book. If you are white in the West and you want to know why us uppity people of color get so annoyed and upset and frustrated when you guys try to talk to us about this, read this book and then never talk to us about it again. And if you are a person of color who has never been able to really articulate the constant frustrations, read the book and you'll get a very clear sense that you're not alone. We pretty much all feel this, and why we feel this, and why it's so difficult to get it through your white friends' heads. The frustrations and the indignities that we kind of face on a daily basis.
Hey, it's important to add, like, as an important caveat or disclaimer, that we do not hate white people. Some of my best friends are whites.
Speak for yourself.
Sorry. Yeah. Just very quickly, I was thinking, because I'm right now just reading novels. I'm being taking a step back from work. So I was thinking, what's a good thing to recommend that's related to this discussion? I think everybody should check out Commons, which is a Ukrainian platform and journal. They had a couple of different, one interview with Joey, one interview with Kavita Krishnan. There's an interview with me coming out in September. So I think it touches a lot on the themes that we discussed in this podcast. So yeah, link that, Joey. You should link that.
And I totally forgot to prepare a recommendation, even though I've been on this podcast numerous times and know that it's coming. So I haven't got anything to share today.
That's yeah, it's fine. I'm currently reading a novel called Terra Ignota. That's the term, by Ada Palmer. It's a part of a trilogy that's set in like the 25th century, and they talk about. I would not give it justice here, but it's like different societies have been built by then, and it's one of those things where the world building is basically what's really good about it. But it's a fascinating thing that I highly recommend. So anyway, on this topic, thank you all for doing this. And as usual, the Fire These Times is a proud sponsor of Send Warplanes to Ukraine. If you would like I don't know how to continue this joke, sorry. But yeah, send warplanes to Ukraine. It's a good thing. Thank you, thank you, everyone. It was really great having you. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.